Welcome to another episode of Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. On this show, we meet artists transforming lives with their work. I was trying to whistle the theme from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but I can't whistle that low to get that last note in there. I was thinking a lot about that movie recently. It came out in 1977. The main character in the film has what is known as a close encounter with a series of UFOs that happen to be flying around Indiana one night. Based on this encounter, this character starts creating a very specific shape out of all kinds of things. Dirt in his backyard, the mashed potatoes he's having for dinner one night. He doesn't know why he's creating this shape. It's just something that he's compelled to do. His wife thinks he's crazy, but he knows that this shape has meaning, and he goes on a quest to understand what that meaning is. This part of the film is my favorite part. It feels really familiar. At some point, I realized that I tended to make documentaries with similar themes. I started thinking about why that was. I think that many artists do something similar. They're drawn to create something, and the understanding of why comes after the creation. My guest on this episode began making prints when she was studying art in school. Using black ink and plain cardstock, she began making prints with delicate and varied lines showing layers of black, white, and gray. She found herself making variations of this design over and over. It wasn't until she took some prints with her to South Dakota that she saw the match. Her printing was manifesting a representation of the Black Hills of her Oglála Lakļóta homeland. This expression of her connection to sacred spaces provided Angelica Yanu with a renewed sense of purpose in her work. It also grounded her as someone who exists in between two worlds. You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Listen and let us inspire you. In her 2020 short film, Maka, Angelica Trimble Yanu says that as an adopted child, as a biracial child, being half white and half Lakota, I always felt like I existed in between two worlds. What really pops out for me in that statement is the phrase, in between. It's something that I've been contemplating since I saw her film and became interested in her work. I think there may be many people who feel that they exist in two separate worlds, or maybe we feel like we've left one world to go and develop further in a new world. That one I can relate to really well. But what does it mean to exist in between two worlds? I wanted to talk to Angelica about this more. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to have her as a guest on the show. The other reason is that I find her prints that represent her homeland to be particularly compelling and arresting. In this conversation with Angelica, she was speaking to me from her shared art studio space at Kala Art Institute in Berkeley, California. It's so great that she's able to work in this community space with other artists. For this reason, you may hear background voices from time to time in our interview. Hi, Angelica. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hi, Pam. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to sit in conversation with you.
Yeah. First question is, can you describe what you do?
Yeah. So I am an interdisciplinary artist. I work primarily in printmaking, specifically monotype. But I also bridge that with sculpture. So I do a lot of paper sculpting and printmaking. And then I also use a little bit of film and documentation in my work as well. I also I work a little bit in community as well. So I'm interested in sort of how art connects with community and how we can heal through making. And I'm an Indigenous artist, so I think that plays a huge role in the work that I make and how I approach my own artistic process.
I've read a little bit about your work, so I wanted to ask you, in the writing that I've read that you've done, you use this description of yourself as existing in between. I'm wondering if you can talk about what does that mean to you And then how does that influence the type of work that you do?
Yeah. So this theme of existing in between two worlds is something that I haven't found an answer to. It's a continuous question, line of inquiry within the work that I make. But I guess to start off, where the first time I felt really connected to that theme probably was in the beginning of my printmaking career when I was an undergrad student at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. I was working on my thesis dissertation, and I realized that, throughout my education, I was trying to develop my artistic voice, and I was having a really hard time finding a place to land within my identity and the work that I make. And I think a lot of that had to do with being half white and half Indigenous, half Oglála Lakļóta. I felt like I existed in two different boxes within society's, vision of me. So when I was trying to find the language to talk about, existing in these two boxes, I realized that it was okay to exist in two worlds, and it was okay to be in the in-between, because I think it was something that made me really uncomfortable earlier on when I was trying to, write about my work. And, I was trying to figure out, can I identify as Indigenous if I am also white? And that is something that I still work through day to day. But my art has helped me feel grounded in this in-between existence. So when I started writing about this in-between world in my thesis dissertation, I came across a Lakota term, Ayeska, that, really it stood out to me in a lot of ways, because the term, for one, was introduced to me by my great uncle, Charles Trimble, who was a Oglála Lakļóta writer. He worked within the Lakota community, just writing, about his experience growing up. And he came up with this term Ayeska, which he translated into meaning interpreter or half-breed. And it was a term that was born out of his understanding of growing up around, children who were also children of white settlers and the Sioux. And him being Lakota, he also had some European ancestry in his bloodline as well. So he was grappling with this in-between world much earlier than I was grappling with it. So I was inspired by his language and understanding of his placement in this world. And so Ayeska became this very important term for me moving forward. And, he talks about this in-between world of being, of white descent and also Lakota descent. He talks about it as being in a place of power in a way. He was able to be this translator, bringing these two worlds together to then, influence, our survival as being Lakota and white. He was really inspiring, just the way that he talked about his experience. And so I've learned to grow into being comfortable with being in between these two worlds. And I think my writing and my visual work reflects that, since I make very graphic, otherworldly landscape prints that reference, a deep tie to sacred space. But it also references, since I'm using, not traditional modes of making to talk about these sacred spaces, I'm incorporating sort of contemporary modes of working. So the integration between, these two ways of making and, bringing these two worlds together through my work is what I find really empowering.
Right.
And strong.
Yeah. Gosh, that prompts so many follow-up questions. But since we're talking about your work I did see some footage on Instagram of the process, and it is such a mix of, you've got a large printmaking machine, I guess I'll call it, but then so much of the work that you do is actually work you're doing by hand. And I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more what your work looks like, because it's very striking. I really haven't seen work that looks quite like yours ever before. So a typical print that you might make, what would it look like and what is it representing for you?
Yeah, I never approach a new body of work with all the loose ends tied up. I work very, I work very innately. I approach things really organically. So whenever I'm making a print, I go into it without expectation. And I think that has bred a lot of anxiety for me, but has also given me a lot of release, because if I didn't approach my work so openly, I wouldn't have done the experimentations that I've done to make such unique work.
Mm-hmm.
So I do really work openly, I guess. And I never know what something is going to look like when I'm printing it. And it's scary, but also exciting. So that push and pull, it fuels my inspiration, and it's what keeps me going. But I think the only common thing that I do when I'm approaching a new body of work is I think about my sacred homelands, and it's almost like a ceremony in a way. Every time I go and print, I keep my ancestors close to me when I'm working, and that keeps the work grounded, I think, in a lot of ways, because I'm really doing it not only for myself, but for a larger reason, for the survival of, our traditions and our connection to our ancestral homelands. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah, I think I just really approach it really open-ended, and experimentation is emphasized in my work consistently.
The other thing I think, when I have listened to you talk about your work, either in video or read what you've said about your work, you talk a lot about this idea of a landscape. And what I see in your work are things that remind me of maybe the rocks and the mountainsides of South Dakota. And even though it may be very open-ended and experimental in a certain way, it's not even that abstract. It's actually, to me, like a really quite beautiful representation of that place that you are connected to. These prints, they're mostly black and white, sometimes with a splash of color, but they're, I'm going to be at a loss to describe them. They do look like this, like the rock formations that have the sediment of, millions and millions of years, which have gone into making this particular landscape. That's what they remind me of anyway. I don't know if that's what you're intending, but that's what I see. I see a place that is very, very ancient and very distinctive when I look at your prints.
Yeah, and I that's a really great thing, just to respond to that comment. It's interesting because when I started art school, I was a film photographer, and I did a lot of landscape photography. And so I didn't start off being interested in printmaking at all. I actually happened to have an extra, I needed some credits, and there was a printmaking class. And I was like, I have all these extra credits, I should just try this. And I believe it was a relief and monotype printmaking class, entry level. And I just decided to do it. And I remember we did a course on monotype, and they were encouraging us to use found objects to make prints. And, I had a pile of cardstock, and I was like, well, I don't really want to use a paintbrush. I want to, they want us to experiment. I was like, well, I guess I'll, try using like the edge of this cardstock. And then that's when things really blossomed. I became really obsessed with making these marks. And I didn't fully understand why I felt such a pull to like keep creating these graphic black and white marks. And I was getting feedback from classmates and my professor, and they're like, it looks like tree rings. And there's a lot of like natural phenomena that people were coupling with like looking at my prints. And it was right around the time, I think, my father, who was Oglála Lakἱóta, he had passed away. And, I was grappling with reconnecting to my roots in South Dakota and grappling with his death and not having been raised by him closely. And, I think I was finding a way to feel close to him. And slowly I, was reaching out to that side of my family and, and learning more about my Lakota roots. And there is so much tied to natural spaces, like so much power tied to landscape and my ancestry. And I realized as I was making these marks, this obsession was deeper than me just liking the way it looked. There was something a lot deeper happening. And I realized that my marks reflected the Heisapa, or our Black Hills, almost exactly. And I think that was in 2016, 2017, when I started to make that connection to my monotype work, to my sacred homelands. And then it wasn't until 2018 when I took a large stack of my monotype prints out to South Dakota to film myself out there, like sculpting my work, that I realized when I held my prints up to the mountainscapes in South Dakota, that there's this seamless, connection.
Right.
And I actually have a photograph of it on my website in the process section, where you can see like almost this, it's insane actually, just how seamless the connection is, I guess. And It kind of, it blew my mind in a lot of ways, because before I even knew my work reflected these landscapes, I felt such a pull to make the work. And it was something that I just kind of stumbled upon in a way. And yeah, I think that having, I've seen other artists, other Indigenous artists have a similar special connection to their spaces and their work. And yeah, I think there's something much deeper and spiritual and powerful going on in the work that I do as an Indigenous artist. It gives me so much happiness to hear that people who know nothing about me or where I come from, who just look at my work, can see that powerful connection to landscape and space and mountainscapes in my work. And yeah, so I guess, it really isn't that abstract, but the way that I stumbled upon it was quite abstract, I guess.
Right. They're also, for me, just incredibly peaceful pieces of art. And I have no idea if that's your experience of them once you've made them, or if there's some sort of conflict there. But that's what I experience when I look at these prints.
I think that's the first time I've heard someone describe my work as peaceful. But I enjoy that a lot, actually, because that's probably the main feeling I feel when I am in those landscapes physically. When I'm standing in the Black Hills, it's almost like an overwhelming peacefulness, like just feeling so at home and grounded when I am actually standing in the Black Hills or the Badlands, or even on the res in Pine Ridge, being in the open space. It's so quiet out there. And yeah, there is a sense of peacefulness when I am in that space. No matter what is going on in my life at that moment, nothing matters when I'm there. So I really enjoy that you get some insight into that feeling that I get when I'm making the work and when I'm in the place that inspires my work.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I read that I want to ask you about is that in our conversation just now, you've said the word survival, but in your writing, you had a term which I had never heard before, survivance.
Yeah.
Can you talk about what that term means?
So that term can translate to the intersection between resistance and survival. So survivance. And that term was introduced to me by a native Anishinaabe writer. His name is, what is his name? I'm going to blank, but he's written a lot about that term. Visner is his last name. I believe it's Gerald Visner. And yeah, so he introduced that term to me when I was doing in my research phases for my thesis dissertation. And he's written quite a lot of literature around that term. And I've seen a lot of artists and writers borrow that term in the way that I have as well from him. So yeah, survivance is that powerful intersection between survival and resistance, and how as Indigenous artists, we are inherently perpetuating this survivance by making and existing and moving through these spaces, especially within the art world, the contemporary art world. I think that us asserting our agency and our voices into these institutional spaces that can feel very sterile and can actually work against Indigenous peoples and have. I mean, museums are notorious for sort of exploiting us in ways and, you know, placing us in the past or as extinct. And so this term has, you know, served as a way for us to like reassert that agency over our spaces and our voices. It's something that I still use quite a lot, but I definitely can't take responsibility for that term. I think it's such a powerful and beautiful term that Gerald came up with, and it's been something that has inspired me throughout my work.
That's such an interesting thing to talk about, that being Indigenous within mainstream culture, society, there's this impulse that you are a part of the past.
I think we are moving in the right direction. I've seen a lot of museums as well make changes, and that's been inspiring. And, you know, I hope that these changes continue to happen. But I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done within these institutions. I feel like there's a fine line between, you know, museums kind of piggybacking on this clout in a way of being woke. So I think it's, you know, there's a lot of care that needs to be taken within these institutions to make sure that they are making these changes for the right reasons.
And maybe with the right input. I mean, like,
yes,
who is there at the table making the changes?
Exactly.
You know, that to me is the fundamental change, is who are the people who are making the changes.
I've seen some really good work being done around this. I have a good friend, Steph Little Bird Vogel, and she is in the Pacific Northwest and an amazing illustrator and activist. But she went into a museum called the Five Oaks Museum that was formerly known as Washington County Museum. And they had a whole exhibit there on Kalapuya people, which is a tribe that she's a part of. And it was a very white settler approach to the history of that land and the history of the Kalapuya people. And she went in there with a Sharpie. I mean, she's a badass lady, and she changed all the panels She worked with an elder in that community who was knowledgeable about the real history of the Kalapuya people. And they both went in there and they completely changed all the panels, and they changed the language, because language is so important in these conversations and
Right.
changing the trajectory. So she actually went in there and, changed things. There were words saying like, the Kalapuya people gave this land, and she changed it and said they stole this land, or the white settlers stole this land from the Kalapuya people. And this exhibition happened in 2019. And it was, I think that, she started changing the course for a lot of museums with that exhibition. She was just featured on PBS NewsHour for that whole exhibition. And yeah, so she went in there and changed the panels, and she's done a lot of like talks about it. She invited me and about 16 other Indigenous current contemporary artists to be a part of the exhibition.
Wow.
And that was a way of her saying, we're here, we're real, we're still here, and we are, resilient. And yeah, that was such an honor to be a part of that exhibition. And it was the first time that I realized, like, okay, the work I'm doing it's much bigger than myself. Like this, the prints that I make it's like an extension of myself to the community and all of our Indigenous communities. And yeah, so that exhibition was so powerful, and it completely changed the way I view my own work. I just feel extremely grateful and lucky to know Steph and to be a part of the work that she's doing.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah, and the exhibition is all online. So for anyone listening, you can go to the Five Oaks Museum website and view all of the artists and the panels that she corrected. And yeah, it's all online right now because of, current times. So I definitely encourage everyone to go check out the exhibition.
I'm just curious, was the name change of the museum in any way a result of her doing this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Five Oaks is, I believe, I might butcher this because I'm not knowledgeable about Kalapuya history or even, their traditions, but from the little bit I've heard her speak about that name change, there's an oak tree on the Kalapuya land that is significant to her tribe. And I believe there might be 5 of the oak trees. And I think that's where the name came from. But those trees are the center of, their cultural identity. So she wanted the museum to reflect her connection to that land, or her tribe's connection to that land. So the whole museum, underwent all of that change because of Steph, honestly. And all the amazing staff at the museum too have been such great allies throughout all of it. And you can tell that, they really care to actually make substantial change in the world. Yeah, so the name change was definitely a part of that.
Wow. Well, what is happening for you currently with your artwork?
A lot, which is great. I've been such a busy bee. I have a couple projects, one that I'm not able to speak on quite yet publicly, but it's very exciting, and that will start in the new year. So I'm preparing for that big project. But currently I have been working on some like grant writing, and I've been honing in some of my sculptural work. I just agreed to take on being part of a group exhibition in Los Angeles with Mata Gallery.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, and I get to show my first short film, Maka, there.
Great.
So I'm very excited to share that with that community. And I'll be showing alongside about four or five other artists who are they're all alumni from the college that I went to. And one of them being a professor that I learned from. So it's fun to be taking part of an exhibition with an old professor and old colleagues. And yeah, the gallery is called Mata, and it's all POC owned and ran. So it's a very awesome community to be a part of. And yeah, that will be opening up in August. And I'll be posting a bit about that on my Instagram. So people should stay tuned for that opening. And what else do I have going on? Well, I know that Pam and I, and as well as Morgan, a Bay Area filmmaker as well, we've applied to a grant at BFF. So hoping to hear back from that.
Yes,
but yeah,
this is Morgan Schmidt-Fang, who was on a couple of episodes ago. And he's the connection how I first became familiar with Angelica's art is through him. Yeah. And
small world.
Small world. And yes, we are going to do a collaboration, whether we get the grant or not. We're going to do a collaboration, but we are hoping for the grant.
Yes, we are crossing our fingers. And yeah, it's been exciting to, work more in the film realm because I grew up in a family of filmmakers. And it's felt like a very natural connection to that world. And I'm excited to be collaborating more this year with people and hoping for more collaborations. Yeah, I've got quite a lot going on.
Well, that's really wonderful. If people want to find out more about your work, Angelica, where can they find you?
Definitely on Instagram. I think I'm most active on there. And my handle is at Angelica Yanu. And then also my website, I try and keep up to date, and that is www.angeltrimbleyanu.com. And so those are both of the best ways to keep up with my work.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was really great to get more insight into your beautiful prints.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pam. It's been a pleasure.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Remember to be in touch on my Facebook page, Art Heals All Wounds, and also on Twitter and Instagram at Art Heals Podcast. I really appreciate Angelica Yanu being a guest on the show today. If you want to learn more about her, I highly recommend looking up her website, AngelicaTrimbleYanu.com. That's AngelicaTrimbleYanu.com. It's a very rich site with work samples, videos of her process, and her writings as well. I also recommend checking out the fiveoaksmuseum.org's website and looking up the exhibition This is Kalapuyan Land that Angelica spoke about in her interview. This exhibition is online in perpetuity, thanks to Steph Littlebird-Fogel. Thanks for listening to this episode of Art Heals All Wounds. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and look us up on arthealsallwoundspodcast.com or get in touch on Facebook or Instagram. The music you've heard in this podcast is Yellow Light District and Otto Waschenlage Instrumental by Lobo Loco. Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 15 in D major was performed by Karina Galanian.